Thank you very much, Ibu Fatima, Mas Duti. Good morning, audience, ladies and gentlemen. So once again, thank you very much for this occasion. Today, I'm once again very grateful to be the moderator of the Alti Malang International Webinar, as well as also opening the grand launching of this organization. So the theme of this webinar is media literacy in foreign language education. I am very grateful once again to have Tatiana de Freitas Massuno, PhD, and Ibu Dr. Mundira Hayu Hum, and Bapak Sahiruddin, PhD, as the speakers of this webinar. So let me, before we continue to the webinar, I would like to inform you that this webinar will be divided into 3 parts. There will be the presentation of the speakers, and then the second one is a Q&A, and then later also I will close it with some closing remarks. So please let me introduce you to the first speaker of this webinar. As you can see on your screen now, so Tatiana de Freitas Massuno, PhD. She got her PhD education from comparative literature from UERJ. UERJ, I think that's in English pronunciation, or State University of Rio de Janeiro. Rio de Janeiro graduated in 2015, but meanwhile, she is now in progress in getting her PhD in bioethics from UFRJ. Well, let's hope that her PhD will finish soon. She is now a digital content curator and content writer in University UNESA or Estácio de Sá University, Rio de Janeiro, State of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So her recent articles published in scientific journals, as you can also read on the screen. One is in 2021, and also the other one is in 2020. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Ibu Tatiana de Freitas Massuno. The time is yours, Ibu. Let me stop sharing the screen.
First of all, good morning. I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here with you. I'm going to share my screen, so let me know if you can see it or not. Oh, I cannot really see my presentation from here. 1 second.
No, I cannot. Probably.
Yeah, I'm going to start sharing now. Okay, now you can see my presentation, right?
Yes.
Okay. So today we are going to be talking about media literacy. Professor Mundi, a while ago, she invited me for this talk, and she asked me to try to think about something that was connected to language and media. And at first I was, what can we talk about? And then I thought of media literacy because in a way it combines all kinds of experience that I have. So as you can see, I am a teacher. So I've been an English teacher for about 20 years. So I have large experience in language teaching. I am a researcher in different areas, nowadays in bioethics. And I'm also a digital content curator, which means that I produce digital materials for undergraduates. So I basically select the topics that students are going to study. I select the content writers, and we put together this digital material. So digital literacy is really in my experience as a teacher and as a curator. But before I move on, I'm going to contextualize a little bit our teaching practices in Brazil, because I'm pretty sure it's probably way different from what happens in Indonesia. And when I started teaching in Brazil in 2002, 2001, 2002. I was first trained as a teacher. So I went through a pre-service training. And at that time, I was told that the language school where I was going to teach was not based on a method. So one of the coordinators told me that they didn't have a method, and she was very emphatic. We don't have a method, we have an approach. At that time, I didn't quite know what it was because I was very new. I was a novice teacher, so I had no idea what methods and approaches were. But I can tell you that in the context of language teaching in Brazil, we are always discussing methods and approaches. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it, about these topics here. Okay. Just to start, just to get started, I brought you a short video. It's a very old video, but it's a video of a kind of method that was very famous a while ago, probably in the 70s. And I'm going to start the discussion by using this method. Okay, so I'm going to show you this short snippet. And I want you to try to think about what kind of assumptions are made about the nature of language teaching and learning. What is the teacher's role? What are the students' roles or role? What activities are employed? And which interactional patterns can be observed? Very short, 1 minute only.
Fine, thanks. How are you? Good. I'm happy to hear that. Today's lesson is going to be about two people, about a salesman, a special kind of a salesman. Now, you know what a salesman is. That's a person who sells something to somebody else, a salesman. We're going to, today the salesman is a vacuum cleaner salesman. And the other person, here's the vacuum cleaner salesman. Let me write that. The other person is a woman, or we could call her a housewife. So now, I want you to just listen and watch what I do. Listen carefully, watch what I do, and try to understand, okay? Now, I'm a salesman now, okay? I'm going to be both people. I'm going to play two roles. I'm going to be the salesman and the woman. Okay. Ring, 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 ring. Ring, 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 ring. Now, the woman. Hello? Hello, madam. Would you like to have the cleanest house in town? Yes, of course I would. Then, madam, you need the amazing Hoover vacuum cleaner. No, I don't. What? Why not? Because my husband does the cleaning in our house. Oh. Okay, now listen, and I'll do it one more time. You just listen and don't talk this time. Listen again.
Okay, I'm not going to play the whole video. It was only for you to have an idea of this kind of language teaching method, which is basically, so you have the teacher presents a dialogue, the dialogue has no context whatsoever. They're talking about vacuum cleaners. And then she says, okay, my husband does the vacuuming in my house. That's it. And then the teacher asks the students to repeat. So the students are supposed to repeat sentences that are contextualized based on a fake dialogue. And this was something that was very common in Brazil a while ago. Yeah, so there was a language school here which was very, very famous. There were many assumptions about this kind of method. First of all, they believed that language was a matter of habit formation. So how do you learn a language? You learn a language as a habit. So through positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. In this case, the teacher is the supreme master. So the teacher is supposed to provide the students with this fantastic input and make sure students repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat until they master the phonological, the morphological, and the syntax of the language. The students are supposed to repeat, so they have no interaction whatsoever, and they have no active role. So when I first started teaching, and the coordinator told me that they had no method, they had an approach, she was referring to this kind of teaching method. She was saying, we don't use the audiolingual method here, we use an approach. But in fact, methods come in all shapes and colors. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, oh no, sorry.
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Okay. So we have different types of methods. We have methods that are language-centered. We have methods that are learner-centered. And we have methods that are learning-centered. So the one that I just showed you is language-centered. So it's basically centered on mastering the syntax, the morphology, the phonology. So we are dealing with the structure of the language. And the students are expected to perfectly reproduce the chunks of language they are exposed to. Then we have the learner-centered methods, which are a little bit more modern in a way because they come from the 70s. And they are based on communication, based on interaction, based on the fact that the language is supposed to communicate something. So we are going to have lots of infogap activities. We are going to have lots of interactions. We are going to take speech acts into account. So this is learner-centered. And more recently, we have been talking about learning-centered methods, which basically means that the teaching of English, it's not supposed to be the most important thing, but it's something that happens incidentally. So you learn English when you're doing something else. So you are learning literature, and then incidentally, you're learning the language as well. You're being exposed to the newspaper, and then incidentally, you are learning the language as well. But when we talk about this here, we encounter a very important situation, a huge problem, because we are still talking about methods, okay? And remember, in the beginning, I told you, the coordinator told me, we don't have a method. So she was basically telling me, there is a problem with the idea of method. And what kind of problem is this? First of all, whenever we talk about method, we tend to assume that certain things are true. When we talk about method, there's always the assumption that there is a best method. So I have the best method, and if you apply this method, you're going to be able to be a perfect speaker. So this is a myth. This is an assumption. There is no best method. Okay? So we believe that method constitutes the organizing principle for language teaching. So the most important thing is method. When we know that this is not true, lots of things come into play when we are talking about language teaching. So we have to pay attention to the students' context, the teacher's context, the emotional states of the students, to how they can interact or not, so many different factors. So method is not the most important one. Thirdly, method has a universal and historical value, meaning that the way that I teach in Brazil should be the same way that I teach in Indonesia, when we know that realities are different. So my students are not your students. So something that may be true for my students love interacting. My students love talking. I don't know if it's the same reality in Indonesia, or if they feel comfortable exposing their ideas and opinions. This is very interesting, the fourth one. Theorists conceive knowledge and teachers consume knowledge. So the great problem with method is that it separates theory from practice. So meaning that the teacher is only the practitioner, but there is a theorist, there is someone who studies the theory behind language teaching that should tell teachers how to behave and how to teach. And the last one is that method is neutral and has no ideological motivation. But of course, we are talking about myths, and we are talking about something, a discussion that has been ongoing since the 2000s. So since the 2000s, we are talking about the death of methods. We are talking about our dissatisfaction with this idea of method. And one of the most important voices in this kind of context is this writer, this author, and he conceived a post-method pedagogy. So we are not going to be talking about method, we are going to be talking about post-method. So in a way, he analyzed the context of the world and he grasped the concept of post-modernity, and he saw this is something similar to what happens to method. So we are living the death of method, but meaning that we should conceive language teaching in a different kind of way. And he says we should probably organize our teaching practices based on 3 different concepts. The first concept is the concept of particularity. So this is something that I basically mentioned before. So we are talking about a specific group of students, a specific group of teachers. So if I'm teaching in Brazil to a group of teenagers, I should cater for my students' needs. So I should deal with the fact that they are teenagers. I should deal with their knowledge of the world. And not the same kind of lesson would apply to adults. So this has to do with how specific situations have an important role in language teaching. The second one is the concept of practicality, meaning that theory and practice should not be separated. So teachers should theorize their practice and they should practice theory, meaning that being a teacher refers to reflect upon our teaching practices. And the third one, which is a very interesting one, it's the concept of possibility. I say this is a very interesting one because this one was based on the books by a Brazilian author, a very famous Brazilian author, Paulo Freire. And he is a very important author in terms of education. So he's one of the most important Brazilian writers in the world. And in this concept, we are talking about the importance of acknowledging the teachers' and students' individual identity, meaning that teaching and learning should be processes that help free students from the state where they are in. So it should emancipate students. So you not only you learn a subject, but you learn how to question your own reality and how to put in perspective the reality that you live in, so that you are not subjugated anymore. So this is the concept of possibility. And since we are talking about these 3 concepts and how they are important in a post-method pedagogy, I want to go to a very important definition by Paulo Freire, who is this Brazilian author I mentioned before. He has a very interesting concept about literacy. I wanted to see this concept, which was written in 1987. Let's discuss this here. Not discuss, but let's read. I'm going to read for you. So this is a book that he wrote with Macedo. And the name of the book was Literacy, Reading the Word and the World. And he says, in literacy, reading the word and the world, we call for a view of literacy as a form of cultural politics. In our analysis, literacy becomes a meaningful construct to the degree that it's viewed as a set of practices that functions to either empower or disempower people. And these 2 concepts are very important for his philosophy, empower and disempower. In the larger sense, literacy is analyzed according to whether it serves to reproduce existing social formation or serves as a set of cultural practices that promotes democratic and emancipatory change. So you can see here that these two concepts, so he's talking about empowering and disempowering. Literacy should help empower the students. And one of the key concepts here is that you don't read what's on the page. You don't read letters. You read the world. So being literate means being able to read the world. Now I have a question, because he wrote this here in 1987. So at that time, the world was completely different. There was no pandemic, there was no Zoom. People communicated basically using telephone or letters. So it was a whole different kind of world. And my question is, what kind of world are we supposed to read nowadays? What does it mean to be able to read the world? And then I have this beautiful picture for you. Okay, so this is basically the world we live in. So it's a world filled with information, filled with notifications. It's a world in which you cannot separate what's virtual and what's reality anymore. And this is what I want to bring you here. Because when we talk about media literacy, we talk about different types of media. So we can talk about traditional media, so we can talk about news, we can talk about TV, but we can also talk about this new world of social media and how this new world affects us and how we can integrate this in our teaching, in our English language teaching. Let me move on. Okay. One of the great problems with this kind of world we live in is that information just keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. I have no idea how many messages I get every day. I have no idea how many notifications I get every day. And when this happens, our brain cannot cope with this amount of information. So what do? We become automatic in a way. So we stop reacting to everything that happens to us. We just consume. And this is one of the great problems with this amount of information that we are living around. We consume them, we don't interpret them, we just consume. But this can cause lots of different problems. And talking about my specific situation in Brazil, I'm going to tell you about something that happened in 2016, because I was never a clear advocate of social media, and I tried to avoid social media at all costs. But then in 2016, something happened that took me by surprise. This is what happened in Brazil. Okay, so there was lots of people going to the streets to protest against the government. At that time, I didn't have Facebook. I didn't have a Facebook account. I didn't have an Instagram account. I was a nobody, okay, in this virtual reality. And I didn't see this happening. And when I looked around, I was not able to read this world because I did not participate in this world. So when the president was impeached, I was taken aback because it was not a reality that I was accustomed to. I didn't see this coming. And then I thought, what's happening? There is a whole new world happening in a kind of sphere that I'm not participating in. There's a whole new kind of information happening in a world that I cannot understand. So this is one situation. Another situation, in 2018, I'm not going to read these quotes. I'm going to leave these quotes for you if you're interested in. In 2018, Bolsonaro, who is the president now, he was elected. And when he was elected, the same situation, I was surprised. Because if you read the quotes, you can see what I'm talking about. And I could not understand how someone who was so sexist, so racist, so full of prejudice would be elected in a country that was supposed to be a country that embraced diversity. And what's happening? Something was happening in the world around that time. It was not only in Brazil. So many phenomena are connected in a way. So if we think about his election, if we think about Trump's election, if we think about Brexit, we are all dealing with a situation in which politics was happening in a different kind of sphere. Politics was not happening on the news anymore. It was not TV. No, it was happening through WhatsApp. It was happening through Facebook. It was happening through Twitter. So the world had changed. Different, very important matters were being discussed in a whole new scenario. And that's why I bring this here for you today, because this kind of events show us that as an educator, as a teacher, they cannot be away from the classroom. So reading the world means being able to understand what's happening and how social media is so ingrained in our lives and how we can cope with this. Based on this, I have something here for you. I talked about literacy, but so far we haven't discussed media literacy. So here I have the first definition for you. So media literacy is a set of perspectives that we actively use to expose ourselves to the mass media, to process and interpret the meaning of messages we encounter. These two words are important. So to process and to interpret. It's not only about passively consuming the media, but it's about interpreting the meaning. We build our perspectives from knowledge structures. To build our knowledge structures, we need tools, raw materials, and willingness. So the tools are our skills. And this is where we come as teachers, the tools. Okay, so the tools mean that students are able to analyze, they're able to evaluate, they're able to discuss, they're able to create. So they're not only passive consumers of media, but they're able to manipulate media as well. But by now, I'm just talking about these concepts here. And I haven't really told you how we can actually integrate this in the classroom. So I mentioned that politics happens in this new area of social media nowadays. But social media doesn't have to be only about politics. It can be fun. So I brought you two different types of examples of activities that can work in the classroom and that can help us boost our students' media literacy. The first one is a fun one. Is this one? So everybody, I think is familiar with this here. So we have this famous American singer, and her picture on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Tinder. And lots of famous people, lots of celebrities try to do the same at that time. So this is a good example of something that can be used in the classroom. How? Let me show you. First of all, we can have an initial discussion on social media. So I can ask my students whether they like social media, what kind of social media they use, what they use the most, what are the advantages or disadvantages. So we can talk about different types of social media. We can discuss the profile pictures to say why different profile pictures are being used. Okay, so they are basically interpreting these visual images that they get access to. Okay. and of course, because we are talking about English language teaching, there's a way for English language teaching. So while my students are discussing the pictures, we can have a revision on language for interaction. We can talk about giving opinions. We can talk about agreeing or disagreeing. We can talk about making suggestions. And at the end, this whole discussion, they can create their own profile. So they are basically having access to social media, to media. They are discussing, they are analyzing, they are evaluating, and they are creating. And this is in a way boosting media literacy and at the same time teaching the language. The language is not taught as chunks of structures, but as taught as something, as a means of communication, as another medium. Another one, I don't know if you remember, but in the beginning, I mentioned that I was not only a teacher, but I also worked with digital materials. So another way to go about it, and how can a teacher create digital materials based on media literacy? We can use news. News is always good because they are authentic material for language discussion and presentation. And something that I encountered this semester was a professor that wrote a lesson on adverbial clauses, on subordinate clauses, and she decided to pick a topic for this lesson. And the topic was climate change. So she was not talking about clauses, she was talking about climate change. So she picked many different examples of different sources on climate change. And then she elaborated this whole lesson on subordinate clauses. So basically what she was telling the students was that there are some reliable sources. These are the reliable sources. So she was guiding students, she was helping students distinguish the good ones from the bad ones. And she was also working with the language on a different kind of way, not as a structure, but as a part of something a little bit bigger. So the language was a medium and not an end in itself. There are many different ways in which we can use media literacy in English language teaching or foreign language education. But why media literacy? And then I'm going to finish with this here. I'm going to finish with Bloom's taxonomy, because whenever we are dealing with media literacy, we are accessing these higher levels of thinking. So we are talking about analyzing, we are talking about evaluating, and we are talking about creating. And most importantly, we are taking our students' perspective into account. We are dealing with the world they are living in. So we are talking about practicality, we are talking about particularity, and we are talking about possibility. I'm going to end here. I'm going to say thank you so much. I hope I didn't talk too much. And that's it.